So, where are we in our class on intermarriage? Well, the first unit, we spent several weeks reviewing the core biblical and rabbinic sources. And actually, we even looked at some Second Temple sources that mention uh, prohibitions on intermarriage. And as I said last week, in normatively speaking, it is very clear from reviewing these sources that there is opposition to intermarriage, opposition even to intimacy between Jews and non Jews, and the promotion of Jewish endogamy in these sources. But what we're beginning to do now, as we review part two, our main task here in part two, is to raise some questions, look at some figures in Jewish history who have muddied the waters on some of these clear, supposedly clear prohibitions by narrowing the categories um, to which they apply, and I think by uh, bringing in voices from Jewish history that have extended or limited the prohibition rather than put everything on the Torah. By that I mean, we hear in rabbinic sources and later the idea that the original prohibition in the Torah actually was very, very limited. And only in time did it begin to extend and extend and extend to get to the point where we are now, where where we read in the Shulchan Aruch, uh, we are prohibited from marriage. It's a serious punishment, but for a Jew who marries a non-Jew, which seems clear, but it's not so clear. So that's where we are. That's what we're doing today. Continuing to muddy the waters. Today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about history and what changed from period to period, because I think that's a fascinating aspect of this story. How the rabbis responded to the historical realities surrounding them, not just the rabbis, but how Jewish leaders responded to the challenges that were surrounding them in different historical periods, and how that might have contributed to their views on intermarriage and how far that ban uh, would extend. So, where we left off last week, the first thing we did was talk about um, that idea that intermarriage is one of the um prohibitions in the holiness code of the Torah, when the holiness code talks about Molech worship, if you remember that, whether that includes, is Molech worship mean intermarriage? And remember, we saw that passage in the Mishnah that says it does not mean, Molech worship does not mean intermarriage. And if somebody translates it like that, you are to silence them. Then we start asking ourselves about what is the extent of lo titchatein bam in the Torah. And we're looking at Maimonides and some of his ideas about what that means. Lo titchaten bam, you shall not marry them. That's from the Torah. Does that mean the 7 Canaanite nations? Or are we talking about all idolaters? Or are we talking about all non-Jews? So what we saw last week is that it's not really clear, is it? Uh, Maimonides seems to say something somewhere and then something else somewhere else, right? Which was, by the way, very common with Maimonides. Let's take a look. Can everybody see? Can everybody see the sources on their screen? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can? Okay, great. So here in Isurei Bi'ah, which is part of the Mishnah Torah, this is Maimonides' compendium of Jewish law, his masterwork, you might say. It says that the biblical prohibition is relations in the context of marriage with a Gentile slash idolater, right? Shar akum mishar umot in Hebrew. An idol worshiper from another nation. So here it looks like Maimonides is saying that to marry a non-Jew, any non-Jew from any other nation, is what lo titchatein bam means in the Torah. That is the law, the biblical law. So if that's all that Maimonides has to say, it would sort of end the conversation. There's nothing else to say. Maimonides has told us that it's in the Bible, so the class is over. But the class is not over. We saw the tour, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, the 14th century rabbi, who lived after the time of Maimonides and comments on Maimonides. He says, a Gentile woman is not forbidden by the Torah. She is only forbidden on rabbinic authority, right? He disagrees with Maimonides and says that the law in the Torah, lo titchaten bam, you shall not marry them, applies to the seven nations. Excuse me. That's what he's quoting Maimonides here. This law applies to the seven nations as well as to the other nations. That's what Maimonides says. But what does the Torah say? But it seems to me that this only applies to the seven nations, for we do not follow Rabbi Shimon, etc., etc. So Maimonides is not the only opinion out there in the realm of the Rishonim. The Rishonim is the group of rabbis who are the principal decisors of Jewish law in the Middle Ages, and the Torah is one of them. And the Torah says, no, it is not a biblical prohibition. It is rabbinic. The biblical prohibition is only about the seven nations. Now, in Maimonides, again, where he lists the 613 mitzvot in the Torah, he says, lo titchatein bam applies to who? It's a prohibition against marrying those who negate fundamental beliefs. Kofrim. Now, this is really weird because kofrim, you can even be a Jew and be a kofer. A kofer is someone who denies fundamental aspects of Judaism, like a Jew who says, I don't believe the Torah is real. I don't believe the Torah is authentic. Well, you're a kofer. If you're a kofer, biblically, you would be prohibited to marriage with, or in marriage to a Jew, right? And then I think we left off with the two final opinions of the Ra'avad and the Minchat Chinuch. The Ra'avad is the one who often fights with Maimonides, disputes with Maimonides in his opinions. And he talks here about an important word that everyone needs to know for this class, and that is a ger toshav. So everyone has to know that a ger toshav is a non-Jew who has come over to the Jewish outlook, let's say. Someone who has come to be ideologically aligned with the Jewish people, but who has not formally converted. You would translate it directly or literally as a resident stranger, but it's a category of non-Jew, let's say a non-Jew who accepts all of the Noahide commandments, that's a ger toshav. So the Ra'avad says this about the ger toshav. The oil of the ger toshav is forbidden to eat, but one may benefit from it. So that's a leniency. And so with his wine, why are we allowed to drink the wine of a ger toshav? Because a ger toshav is not an idolater. And he continues, and if we are afraid a Gentile might have touched it, that sort of doubt is not sufficient to forbid benefiting from the wine. Nonetheless, it is forbidden to drink it on the possibility that a Gentile touched it or for fear of intermarriage, because the ger toshav is nonetheless covered by the ban of do not marry them. Now, when you talk about, let's say you have the ladder of non-Jews, okay? This is a crazy idea, but follow me here. Let's say you have the ladder of non-Jews, and the highest people on the ladder they're the ger toshav. That means the people who are ideologically totally aligned with Judaism, but they haven't converted. The lowest people on the ladder are idolaters, not just non-Jews, but non-Jews who actively worship idols. Well, according to the Ra'avad, everyone on the ladder, from the idolater all the way up to the ger toshav, is covered by the biblical ban, do not marry them. And the Mincha Chinuch, by the way, below agrees. It seems that with respect to the biblical prohibition on intermarriage, a ger toshav is included as well. It is a biblical violation. But everyone needs to realize, when I say everyone, I mean you all my students, right? You all need to realize that is not the only position out there. Remember the Tur. The Tur himself says it only applies to the 7 nations, lo titchatein bam. So you have here 2 extremes in a way. The Tur says it's only the bottom rung of the ladder. Actually, it's lower than the bottom rung of the ladder, because it's not even idolaters. It's only idolaters from the 7 nations who are covered in the biblical prohibition. And then you have the other extreme, which is the Ra'avad and the Mincha Chinuch, who say, no, it's everybody on the ladder. The biblical ban applies to everybody on the ladder. What I'm trying to show you in reviewing these different opinions is that, first of all, it goes without saying, Judaism is very complicated. Okay, let's start with that. This is a very complicated religion. How can you have rabbis disputing the extent of a ban, extent of the other? And remember, this is very important, because if you say that all non-Jews are covered by the biblical ban, lo titchatein bam, in many ways that ends the discussion. So what I want to show you is that is not where the discussion necessarily ends, because we have other rabbis who dispute with Maimonides and say not necessarily so. The biblical ban only covers the bottom rung of the ladder. Everybody else, we have to tell a different story about how they ended up on the no list, but they weren't included there originally. So today we're going to pick up on in section 4 of part 2, okay? Vigilante justice and excision in what case? What is the vigilante justice stuff? I think we covered this a little bit last week. This, remember, is the section that we read from the Mishnah that says, if you find somebody who is engaging in intercourse with a non-Jew, kanaim pogim bo. The extreme ones, the vigilante ones, the ones who are passionate they come and they get you. Get you, I mean they kill you. Now remember, this is based on a story in the Torah, the story of Zimri and Pinchas, right? Zimri, who is found copulating with a Midianite woman, and Pinchas comes and slays him with a spear. Okay. Now, what does Maimonides say about this Mishnah, which might, I mean, if you really are extreme, which might suggest that I have the right to go into any hotel room I want to, any motel room, and bring my spear with me and see if there's any Jews there with non Jews and slay whoever I would like. And that would be within the bounds of what is permissible. So let's see if that is true or not. Jerry, would you kindly read um, from Maimonides?
A man who has intercourse with the daughter of a ger toshav, i.e., a woman who is not an idolater, is not killed by zealots, but he is lashed on rabbinic authority for being rebellious.
You're back.
See, a good rabbi always has a backup. When the local internet fails, it's good to have a backup hotspot system. Okay, everyone can hear me loud and clear? Okay, great. Ricky, what was the last thing that I said before I got cut off? Let's see if Ricky was paying attention.
I don't remember.
Uh-oh.
I just read.
Oh, Jerry. Okay. You had read. Can you do that one more time for me, Jerry? I'm sorry to make you do it again.
Okay. A man who has intercourse with the daughter of a ger toshav, i.e., a woman who is not an idolater, is not killed by zealots, but he is lashed on rabbinic authority for being rebellious.
Excellent. Okay. So Maimonides says you don't kill someone for having intercourse with the daughter of a ger toshav. So someone, again, remember the ger toshav, someone who is not an idolater, but who's come over to the Jewish way of thinking, she is not included in what the Mishnah has to say about um, intercourse with non-Jews, right? Or what the Mishnah might seem to be saying about someone who has intercourse with non-Jews. However, you get some corporal punishment. You get lashes on rabbinic authority. Why? Because you're being rebellious. Makinoto makat mardut. You're being rebellious. Rebellious means you're not listening to what the rabbis are saying. Someone who violates a rabbinic commandment gets in trouble, but it's a different kind of trouble. Like, as in, you're not going to get a spear right through your heart, but you're going to get punished because you're not listening to what the rabbis have to say. Now, that's a big change from what we thought the Mishnah might have been saying, right? What this introduces into the discussion, which I find quite fascinating, is it all depends on who she is. Who is she? We need to know about her religious beliefs. We need to know about what her religious practice is. We need to know, in this case, who her father is and where her father belongs, right? What church or mosque or temple does her father belong to? And maybe that will influence how we relate to her. Okay? Now let's continue in Maimonides, but hear from a different source in Maimonides, his commentary on the Mishnah. Jerry, could you continue reading?
Sure. One who has intercourse with an Aramean woman. This is a case where a man has intercourse with a female idolater in public, in a group of 10 Jews or more, but only at the time of the act itself, as in the case of Pinchas.
Okay, so look at this. I love this when the rabbis do this. Look at the narrowing. Look at the narrowing of the prohibition. So 2 minutes ago, I thought that if I went into a hotel room and found a Jew and a non-Jew having sex, I could take my spear and kill them, right? But Maimonides, in his read, narrows the case and says, actually, you can't. Earlier on, he says, first of all, it doesn't apply to the daughter of a ger toshav. But now he goes even further and includes others in the exceptions to the rule. Who are those exceptions? Anyone who is not an idolater. Also, anyone who is doing this in private. There goes my hotel idea, right? It has to be in the middle of the street, not just in the middle of the street. There has to be 10 Jews or more who are present and doing nothing, right? That's what the rabbis consider to be a public act, that there's a minyan there present. And also, I could only do it at the time of the act itself, as in the case of Pinchas. Sorry about the way that that's written, but that's Pinchas, right? Only in the middle of it can I use my spear. So what Maimonides basically does is he if I'm a vigilante and I'm interested in going out and killing people who are violating the law, he ruined my day, Maimonides, because he says you can't. Sorry, I'm going to make the circumstances so narrow where you can actually use your spear. You may as well trade in your you may as well sell your spear on Kijiji. It's you won't have any use for it. And this is often done in the Rishonim, often done with the interpreters of the Mishnah, those like Maimonides. He can't erase what's already written. He can't erase what it says, Kanaim Pogimbo, you take your spear and you kill them. But what he can do is narrow the circumstance so that it hardly ever applies. That's what Maimonides is doing here. Keep going, Jerry.
But once they have separated, or if it was not in the presence of the Jewish community, or if she was not an idol worshiper, it is forbidden to kill him.
Right.
But he is liable for...
I want to highlight this. If she was not an idol worshiper, it is forbidden to kill him. So the punishment only goes to someone who has sex with an idol worshiper in public. Very, very important. So what happens if she wasn't an idol worshiper?
But he is liable for karet for a female idolater, even though this is not mentioned in the Torah, nor is it enumerated as one of the violations that carries this penalty. Rather, it is a received tradition explicated in scripture, in Malachi.
So what happens to the person who is found to be, not found to be having sex with a female idolater, but I heard, right? Because remember, if I actually found them and there were 10 Jews there, I could use my spear. But what happens to somebody who is having sex with a female idolater? Karet. Karet is excision, cut off from the people. But Maimonides makes it clear that that tradition of cutting off such a person, excising them, is not mentioned in the Torah. It's a received tradition. He says it's explicated in Malachi. We saw that verse in Malachi, but what's important to note here is Maimonides says it is not biblical. It's just something that we do. He doesn't really know. He thinks it comes from Malachi, but does not ascribe it to a particular verse in the Torah. Keep going, Jerry.
The sages explained that a Jewish man who has intercourse with a Gentile woman is liable for many lashes. but these are all of rabbinic authority.
So here Maimonides changes the word, not to an idolater, but to a but with a Gentile. In the Hebrew, haba al hagoya. So if she is not an idolater, she's just a non-Jew, the punishment is different. It is certainly not mentioned in the Torah, that prohibition. It comes from the sages. That means rabbinic authority. And what happens when I find you? You get lashes. Lashes on rabbinic authority. So this adds on what Maimonides says earlier about lashes with the daughter of a ger toshav. I could change this from daughter of a ger toshav to daughter of any non-idolater in Maimonides' point of view. As long as she is, or her father, is not worshiping idols, there is no biblical ban, but you get lashed on rabbinic authority. What we're basically able to do with these sources is evade. I know that's a strong word, but I think we are able to evade many of the biblical prohibitions, or what we thought were clear biblical prohibitions, by narrowing them in this way. So if someone says to you, no, you can't marry a non-Jew because it says in the Torah, lo titchatein bam. Well, all you have to do is just quote them Maimonides and say, no, lo titchatein bam, that doesn't apply to non-Jews. That only applies to idol worshippers. Okay, but what about the story about Pinchas? He found Zimri with the Midianite woman, and he took his spear and slayed him. But again, you show them this source in Maimonides and say, that only applies to the case of an act that is done in public, again, with an idolater. But that's not comparable to, let's say, the cases that we find today. So now I want to move forward to the time of the Hasmonean decree. Now we saw the Hasmonean decree mentioned 2 classes ago in that very complicated section of the Talmud that I don't want to return to because you probably will all log off because it's so confusing. But just remember from that section, right? We don't have to remember everything, but if you could remember something, there's a story told, the opinion of one of the rabbis is that the ban on intermarriage expanded over time, and that the major decree against intermarriage did not come from the Torah. The Torah only excluded the 7 Canaanite nations, but it came in the time of the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans we know of from the story of Hanukkah. So we know approximately when we're talking about the 3rd century BC, 2nd, 3rd century BC. But what we don't know is who the court of the Hasmoneans is. Did it ever really exist? So we have a timeline, but maybe not a specific identity of what the court of the Hasmoneans is. But the timeline, I think, is actually much more interesting. So thank you, Jerry, for reading. Let's read and just recap, familiarize ourselves a little bit. Florence, would you read, please, the Yad Ramah, what he reminds us of
Where is it?
regarding the Hasmonean decree? Right here when Rav Dimi came.
When R. Dimi came, he said, the court of the Hasmoneans decree that one who sleeps with a Gentile woman is liable on account of four things. For an idolatrous woman, because even though she is not one of the seven nations, they forbade relations with her because she leads him astray.
So I'm going to break that. Excellent. I'm going to break this down a little bit to explain why I think this source is very important. Remember, the Talmud said the court of the Hasmoneans played a role in banning intermarriage. And Rabbi Meir Abulafia, medieval Spain, says this is true. That's true. It was the court of the Hasmoneans that changed the rules, and they banned a Gentile woman, mishum nashka. Now, do you see these four Hebrew letters? Nashka. Nashka is not a word in Hebrew. It's an acrostic. Each letter stands for something. Nun stands for nida, right? Etc., etc. All four different ways they banned Gentile women. It's not, I'm not going to go over all four because there's one that's really important, and that's the kaf. Kaf stands for either kuti or kochavim umazalot. Stars and, let's say, the stars and the astrology symbols, right? Because these astrology, am I getting it right? I forget whether it's astronomy or astrology. I always confuse the two. These astrological symbols that are in the sky, people worshipped them, right? Virgo and Libra, you know what I mean. So because she worshipped, presumably, the stars and the astrology, she was forbidden to him. But hold on. Why would she be forbidden? And this is where you read, Florence, because even though she's not one of the seven nations, they forbade relations with her because she will lead him astray.
Because of astrology? Oh, okay.
Because she will lead him to worship idols. But there's something more here that I think is really important from the historical perspective. What is Hanukkah? Hanukkah, is it about a vial of oil that lasted longer than it should have? Okay, I know you all know that story. That is part of the story of Hanukkah. But let's not forget, the main story of Hanukkah is about a war between Jews and Greeks, but that doesn't say enough. Actually, we know historically that a major component of the war was about Jews fighting other Jews. And what were they fighting over? They were fighting over assimilation. How much can we become Greek, and how thick must the boundaries be between Jewish culture and Greco and Greek culture, Alexandrian, Syrian Greek culture? Now, in the Bible, when the Bible says don't marry the seven idolatrous nations, the Bible is also saying you could marry from an idolatrous nation outside of those seven. Let me repeat that because it's a bit crazy. If the Bible only says lo titchatein ba means the seven Canaanite nations, that means that if I lived at the time of the Bible and I found myself a nice Edomite woman, or I think I gave the example of an Irish, right, idol worshiper, or wherever, somewhere from outside of the seven nations. You pick your favorite country. And I wanted to marry her, and she was worshiping idols. I would be permitted to do so because the biblical ban only applied to the seven nations. Now, what happens in the time of the Hanukkah story, the Jewish civil war, the fight against the Syrian Greeks? Well, suddenly, Jews are no longer a majority in their land. Actually, it wasn't sudden, but it happened over time. Jews are not the majority culture anymore. And even though we're still living in the land of Israel, we're living among other nations and clearly cannot compete with the Greco-Roman expansion, which is taking over the world, right? All over the Mediterranean. And suddenly, the Hasmonean court, whoever that is, becomes very nervous. Because prior to them, I could marry a Greek, couldn't I? I mean, I'm talking about a Greek woman who was worshiping Zeus, but I could marry her. And the Torah wasn't so worried that I could marry her, that I would marry her, because if I'm the dominant culture, if I'm living in the context of a land like the Bible describes, which is the land of Israel, predominantly inhabited by Jews, then I'm not so worried about marrying a Greek woman, because chances are she will assimilate into the predominant culture, and certainly into her husband's culture and religion. But things change in the Hasmonean period. Jews are now fighting between themselves about how much they should be associating or could be associating with the cultures that are surrounding them. And that's when the Hasmoneans decide to put their foot down. The story of Hanukkah is the victory of the endogamous against the assimilationists. Let me repeat that. The story of Hanukkah is the victory of the endogamous against or over the assimilationists. We kick them out of our temple. We returned the Jewish practice of circumcision and Bible reading and everything that they had tried to destroy. And folks, doesn't it make sense that in the context of that victory, the Hasmonean court would also say, and no more intermarriage with idolaters? All idolaters. No more intermarriage with all idolaters. As much as we want or would like to believe that the Bible forbade marriage between Jews and all idolaters, and there are definitely opinions that say, we saw them, definitely opinions that say, yes, that's the case, the Yad Ramah is telling a different story here about a reaction to reality, very much in keeping with the spirit of the Hanukkah story, of the spirit of that time. And the reaction is no more marriage with those people, because we saw where it led when we allowed it. and we saw Jewish men taking Greco-Roman women, and we had to fight a whole war to until we could get rid of them, stop that trend, and we don't want to do that anymore. So we're just going to issue this decree. Even though she's not one of the 7 nations, they forbade all relations with her. That is the reading of the Yad Ramah. So the Hasmonean decree is a response to the pressures, the reality that was occurring at the time, at least according to the Yad Ramah. Okay? So now let's move on to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. To refresh your memories, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai were fighting over the extent of the prohibitions between Jews and non-Jews. Can we drink their wine? Can we eat their food, their oil, and among those things, their daughters. And remember, they were in an attic, and a couple of people from Beit Hillel's camp didn't show up, so Beit Shammai got the upper hand, and Beit Shammai was able to pass the 18 different prohibitions, which included the prohibition against intermarriage. Okay, now, is it intermarriage against idolaters or intermarriage against everybody? Well, if we say that the prohibition against idolaters happened in the time of the Hasmoneans, then what was it exactly that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai banned? So let's see. Just to refresh your memory, I included the source here from the Talmud. Let's review it. Let me see who I want to pick on this morning. Clara, are you able to read for us? Do you see where it says Geneva? I need you to unmute. Let me try again. Press the unmute button. There we go. Okay. Third
They were
time's a
all
charm.
banned on account of idolatry.
Sorry, start right from the beginning. Geneva.
Geneva, in the name of Rav, said they were all banned on account of idolatry. When Rav Ahabada came, he reported in the name of Rav Yitzchak. They banned their bread and oil on account of their wine, and their wine on account of their daughters, and their daughters on account of another thing, and another thing because of another thing.
Now, remember, what does it mean? And another thing on another thing and another thing. They banned their daughters on account of another thing. Those of you who missed that class 2 weeks ago, another thing means idolatry. It's so disgusting to the rabbis that they won't even say the word. They just say davar acher. It's another thing. So what was the fear of Beit Shammai? It was all about idolatry. That's why he instituted all of these bans, or his students instituted all of these bans, including their bread and their oil and their wine and their daughters. It all had to do with idolatry. Keep going.
In fact, the court of the Hasmoneans banned intercourse, but not being in private seclusion. The house of Shammai Hillel banned even this.
So this is how, remember, this is how we understand the progression of the prohibition. The progression went, okay, the Bible forbade the 7 nations. The court of the Hasmoneans, they banned all idolaters, but all idolaters only in public. Right? If you were having a public relationship with an idolatrous woman, that would not be permitted. But the houses of Hillel and Shammai, they bound public and private relationships with all idolatrous women. Okay. Now we're going to keep going. If you could keep reading, Clara, this section from the Talmud Avodah Zarah. Let's read it first, and then I'll explain why I included this.
I Ger Toshav's oil is like his wine.
So remind us, Clara, what is a ger toshav?
Uh, my mind is blank.
A ger toshav. He's the friendly non-Jewish person. He's on the top rung of the ladder, right? Closest to the Jewish worldview, but he did not convert. So there's a discussion in the Talmud about whether we're allowed to use his oil or drink his wine. Why is it a discussion? Because if the main fear is idolatry, well, we're not afraid that a ger toshav is going to be using those products for idolatry because he's not an idolater. So that's what makes this really important. The previous source says we're talking about idolatry, another thing for another thing. All of the intermarriage prohibitions of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai and the Hasmonean court, they all had to do with idolatry. So now the Talmud Bavli says, okay, now let's deal with a non-idolater. Where does a non-idolater fall? And this, I'll jump to a bit of a conclusion here, friends, but this is what's really important, because today many of the people that we live with, they are not, or there's a question about whether they are idolaters. Is an atheist an idolater? Is a Christian an idolater? A Muslim, according to almost all sources, are not idolaters. So does that mean that Jews are permitted to marry Muslims? Let's see. I mean, all of this is going to depend on how the discussion begins, and it begins in the context of this ger toshav. Okay, go ahead, Clara. The ger toshav's oil.
A ger toshav's oil is like his wine. Example, one may benefit from it but not consume it.
So there's a lesser degree of fear. The prohibition is less, but it's not complete.
With respect to everything else, he is like an idolater.
Okay, so the first opinion that's mentioned here in the Talmud is that with regard to his wine, the ger toshav's wine and his oil, the same thing, we make an exception. We're not allowed to drink his wine, but we're allowed to benefit from his wine. If we were talking about an idolater, I would not be able to sell his wine or his oil. But a ger toshav, I am allowed to sell it. I can't drink it, but I could sell it. But there's another opinion here. Rabbi Shimon
says his wine is like the wine of libation, and one may not benefit from it.
Okay, hold on. So Rabbi Shimon is more strict. He says, nope, ger toshav is just like an idolater. It's the same thing. You can't drink his wine, and you can't benefit from that wine. There is no exception to any rules for a ger toshav. Now, that's going to be a big challenge for us, because if there's no exception to the rule for a ger toshav, then since wine is part of those 18 prohibitions, right, just like their daughters, then we would have to say the same thing about the daughter of a ger toshav, that she is treated the same way as the daughter of an idolater. But the Talmud isn't finished yet. It throws something else at us. Keep going, Clara.
Some report in his name, it is permitted to drink it.
Oy, oy, oy. Okay, folks, follow me here. Rabbi Shimon says, no, his wine is wine like the wine of libation. You can't benefit from it and you can't drink it. But some say, nope, actually Rabbi Shimon was very permissive. He said you can sell it and you can drink it. Now this is, folks, the problem with a oral tradition. When it comes time for the Talmud to try and remember what Shimon said, you have two reports that are completely the opposite, one from the other. So this passage opens up and says, a ger toshav is treated somewhere in the middle, right? You can have their wine sold in your store, but you can't drink it. But I remember Rabbi Shimon had a problem with this. I just don't remember what the problem was. Either the problem was he was very strict and said, nope, he's like an idolater. Or he was very, very lenient and said, nope, a ger toshav is treated like a Jew. This is really important in our discussion, because if Rabbi Shimon believes that it is permitted to drink the wine of a ger toshav, what would he say about their daughters? I'm sorry for the sexist language here, but this is the context of the Talmud, right? What would he say about their daughters? Would the daughter of a ger toshav also be permitted? If the whole reason she's forbidden is because of idolatry, well, that's the same reason the wine is forbidden. So if I'm not concerned about idolatry, then maybe the ban of the house of Shammai does not apply to a ger toshav. Is everybody following me here?
Mhm.
If it all comes back to idolatry, then what do we do with the ger toshav? Rabbi Shimon, actually, some people said that a ger toshav you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about idolatry with them. Well, the repercussions of such a point of view are very, very serious. That means a ger toshav, I don't have to have many boundaries at all with them. Now you can see that this is going to raise, you could guess that this is going to raise a terrible fight between the Rishonim, the commentators on the Talmud. What are they going to say about this confusion about Rabbi Shimon's point of view? Lionel, would you do us the honor of reading this next passage from the Meiri? Before we read the Meiri, just a reminder, when or an insight that some of you may not know, there's a big debate about whether Jews are allowed to go into churches or not. Did you all know that?
Yeah.
Are Jews permitted to go into churches? Because what might a church be? It might be considered a house of idolatry. And there's a debate, given that many Catholic churches have statues everywhere. There's a debate about whether it is considered idolatry, very different than a mosque where no statues or images are permitted. And famously, it was the Meiri who said that Christian houses of worship are not to be considered houses of idolatry, that they are a monotheistic religion and they don't follow. Now, most rabbis disagreed with him. Most rabbis disagreed and said, yes, it is a house of idolatry. But I think it's important we realize just before we read this, that the Meiri, this is a crucial argument for him. This is going to be a crucial point because he's living in Provence where the people around him are Christians. And he has already said Christians are not idolaters. Well, if Christians are not idolaters, then maybe one can marry them. Maybe their daughters are permitted because they're considered to be like a ger toshav. And if we have no fear of idolatry, maybe we might be able to marry them. Or maybe, to say it a little bit less, maybe the prohibition on marrying them is much less of a prohibition. It's not like the worst thing imaginable. It's just something that we should punish somebody for. If you marry a Christian, you should be slapped and whipped, and maybe we hang up your picture and say this is a bad person. But that's very different than if you marry an idolater where you're supposed to be cut off from the people. And we sort of envision that as being the worst outcome that could possibly be. So Lionel, let's see what he has to say about what we just read.
Even though one could explain the restrictions around the wine of a ger toshav as stemming from a fear that he does not guard it from contact with idolatrous Gentiles, most commentators agree that the concern is on account of the fear of intermarriage. And based on this, recent sages in these lands have forbidden drinking the wine of several peoples, even though they are not idolaters.
Okay, thank you, Lionel. So let's end with this source over here, but I have a lot to say on it, okay? The Meiri reports that there is an argument taking place in Jewish law about the wine of the ger toshav. And it is a really important argument, not because there's a disagreement that it ought to be banned. Everyone agrees that it ought to be banned. But the disagreement is why it ought to be banned. He says most commentators agree that the reason the wine ought to be banned is because of intermarriage. Now, why does that make sense? I ban somebody's wine because of intermarriage? Well, wine, as some of you may know, is a very ideal social lubricant. If you want to mix with people and have a good time and go to parties, there's going to be wine there. And when you have wine, the boundaries begin to thin between peoples. And the Meiri says that in these lands, that means in Provence, in the area where he lives, that is the big concern. It's that if we allow non-Jewish wine, then Jews will go to clubs and bars and drink that non-Jewish wine, and they will end up marrying a non-Jewish person. So the predominant opinion in the time of the Meiri is idolatry is not the primary concern.
Intermarriages.
It's intermarriage. So remember, I introduced the question when we started this class, and I said we're going to have to ask it over and over and over again. What is the primary fear? What is the secondary fear? There were those who felt, and we saw this in the Talmud Bavli, and he even reports it here, that the primary concern is idolatry. So why do we ban the ger toshav's wine? It's because, yeah, I know that the ger toshav doesn't practice idolatry himself. I understand that. But I know that he has friends. His cousin comes over a lot, and his cousin is an idolater. And I think that cousin will take the wine off the shelf and might sacrifice it to Zeus. And that's what I'm worried about. So the primary fear is intermarriage with regard to the wine, and that would have an impact on what I felt about intermarriage. Because I would then say, well, if a woman had, that I knew had a cousin who was idolatrous, she would also have an influence on her. And even though she might consider herself to be, even though she wasn't converted, she would consider herself to be friendly to the Jews and a ger toshav and believe in the major Jewish ideals, I still wouldn't allow it because I'm afraid of idolatry. Versus what ended up becoming the predominant point of view in Provence, which is the times have changed. Today, we are not worried about idolatry, which makes sense, right? With the Meiri's point of view. Remember, he doesn't believe that Christians are idolaters. So he can't say the fear is idolatry. If he says the fear is idolatry, then he'll be promoting in some way intermarriage. because he doesn't feel Christians are idolaters. So he says, no, that is not the issue. It's a total shift from what we read in the Babylonian Talmud above, which says it's all because of davar acher. It all comes from idolatry. No, it doesn't. The Meiri says, I'm going to respond to the circumstances in which I find myself. And the circumstances in which I find myself are, we are living now with a group of people who are not idolatrous, but they have the equally strong potential to lead Jews astray. Yeah, they won't lead them to idolatry, but they're leading them away from Judaism. And because of that, I will ban their wine and consequently, obviously, maintain the ban against their daughters. I want clear cultural distinctions between Jews and non-Jews. And for him, he almost takes the whole discussion up a notch by making the ban against intermarriage primary, overwhelming, in a sense, the fear against idolatry, which one could say was not as much a reality in 14th century Provence as it was 1,000 years earlier in Babylonia or in Palestine, Greco-Roman Palestine. So I'll take some questions now, but just before I do, what we saw this class, if I could summarize it in one sentence, we are seeing more and more Jewish leaders carving out the ban against intermarriage according to the fears that they have in their current space and time. That is going to be disappointing, as I said, to those of you who want to believe that it all comes from the Torah. It could be, right? And we have sources that say that. But we have other very important sources that don't. That see rabbis, leaders, courts responding to their fears. We saw it most predominantly in the story of the Hasmonean court. Now, the Hasmonean court isn't worried about the 7 Canaanite nations anymore. They're worried about the war they just fought over Jewish identity, over Zeus being placed in the temple. They hate all idolaters. And we see it also in the Meiri, who says, actually, it's not idolatry today that we're worried about. We're worried about maintaining cultural, national integrity, living as a minority among non-idolatrous people. And if we permit the wine and we permit their daughters, and if we lessen that ban at all, we're going to end up disappearing. It opens the window into, what I'm trying to do in the second part of the class is, well, are we stuck in a corner on intermarriage? Or do we have a responsibility to respond to the world and the time in which we find ourselves? And what is the right response? I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm leaving it with you. If you were the Hasmonean court, what would you have decided? What would you have said? You saw what happened. You saw the fighting, you saw the war, you saw the death, you saw the destruction. What would you have said when they would say to you, should we be stricter on intermarriage? Should we maybe tighten the restrictions a little bit? What would you have said? And again, in the time of the Meiri, where people are drinking wine with ger toshavim, non-Jews, but who are friendly non-Jews. People are drinking wine with them. What would you say? You're living in the 13th century. That's after the Crusades. How would you respond? Is that okay? Should we build the walls or reduce them? What are you afraid of? What are we afraid of? Why are we? And does that fear somehow dictate the law? It's a scary thought. But I think there's a lot in here that might exactly affirm that it is fear that is pushing these boundaries thicker and thicker. Okay, let me unmute, take a look at some comments in the chat. I'll just ask if you have noise in the background, if you could please stay muted. But I've just given everybody the ability to unmute
Fabulous.
if they would like.
Rabbi. Wow.
Thank you, Rose.
So good.
Okay, you can, let me see. The narrative changes with time, Ruth says. That's right, to suit the social and cultural shifts. Exactly. Exactly. But is it a reality now? Okay, so I'm not answering that question for you. I'm not there yet. But I really like the discussion because I think that it, you know, I started out this class saying I hate the demographic discussion. How many Jews do we gain if we do this, and how many Jews do we lose if we do that? That's not what it should be about. We should look at the circumstances in which we find ourselves and decide if I was in charge, if I made the rules, what would our time call for? What are our fears? Can we relate at all to the fear of the Hasmonean court or the fear of the Meiri? Idolatry, I mean, I would presume to say, is not the main fear. So when we read all of these sources that say it's idolatry, we discount them and say, oh, perfect. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff anymore. So none of the prohibitions that stem from idolatry apply. I can drink wine from wherever I want, have oil from wherever I want. But that's when the Meiri's voice comes in and says, wait. There's something else besides idolatry that we should be worried about. And he doesn't really fully explain why intermarriage is the concern, but we can presume. We know what he means.
So the truth is, we're losing, like when we bring that history to today, we're losing so many Jews to intermarriage. And I don't know if it's the same now as it was at the time of Rabbi Hirsch in the 1800s, because he talks the same sort of story. And our numbers never change, other than, well, they annihilate us. Only when they annihilate us, then we have to regrow. So it's a very delicate balance between letting people in and being more inclusive. And then where do you draw the line to saying we have to be strict on our rules, because it's an impossible question to answer.
Yeah. Well, you're wrestling with, exactly, but I don't want you to answer the question. I just want you to wrestle with it.
Oh.
Feel the dilemma that our ancestors faced. They don't have a text that's telling them this is how you respond. They are intuiting, based on what happened before, how we ought to navigate today. But you can see in the Meiri, there are those who still felt that it was about idolatry. So he's having an active argument with other sages. And we're not even done yet.
So
Other other questions or comments? Nothing from this group?
we've already commented a lot on
Left you speechless?
we've commented a lot, I think, on the chat.
I think we're all speechless because we realize, because the way you presented this, we realize what an unbelievable dilemma we're facing now.
Today.
And
Right.
it's not about defining idolatry, intermarriage, or anything. It's about watching the Jewish people change. I don't know what word to
Yes.
use. Is change a good word, but diminish? I don't know. Change? I have no idea. That's leaving me speechless. So I thank you very much.
Okay. So speechless in a good way.
That's right.
Well, in a frightening way, but like it's a wake-up call to really think about what's at stake here.
Yeah.
And also what has happened historically. Sometimes
Yeah.
we have to go down to nothing to come back again.
Oh my gosh, no.
Yeah, I know.
God forbid, God
I
forbid.
know, but that's the reality, maybe. Maybe
Sometimes,
that's the reality.
you know, when it helps to look at these sources, because when you see somebody who's fallen in love with someone who's of a different faith,
Yeah.
it's hard not to be sympathetic to the situation and not to want the best for them. I mean, there's very little you can do in a situation like that. We live in a free country. People have the right to live their lives as they wish. But when you look at these sources, you're put in a different position. There's no people in front of you. I'm making all of you the rabbis. I'm putting you all in the seat of Maimonides, in the seat of the Meiri, in the seat of the Hasmonean court. And I've sometimes, played this out with a couple who is deciding that intermarriage is right for them. They would say, look, it's right for us, but we wouldn't want Judaism to permit this. We're okay with you,
Yeah.
Rabbi, maintaining your boundaries, because if we were you, we would do the same thing. But we just want to have the freedom to sort of opt out of that, because, we fell in love with each other, and we don't want our love to infect Judaism in some way, or to change Judaism. And I think that's a really helpful conversation. When you put somebody in the position of, okay, if you had to design Judaism and wanted it to survive in the time of the Greco-Romans, in the time of the Christians, in the time of the Muslims, in the time when you're surrounded by idolaters, in the time where you're surrounded by the 7 nations, and what are we surrounded with today? Well, if you had to design a religion, what would you do? And
Can I ask a question?
yes, yeah, Ross.
So does all this remember in the first class, I think it was Ezra, and he talked about a remnant, and it was after the destruction of the temple.
Example. Great.
So
great,
is
great.
that where it's stemming from? I mean, because earlier than that, are they really worried about
No.
about marrying Gentile women? I mean,
No.
is that the chronology, that the remnant is the beginning of this fear?
Ezra, his he's after the biblical ban, right? So the beginning, if you want to find the origin of this, it's the lo titchaten bam, right? That's in the Torah. You shall not marry with them. And some people feel that the biblical ban covers all non-Jews, but the predominant opinion is that biblical ban only covered the 7 Canaanite nations.
So when
That's where
Ezra
it
is
comes
right, when Ezra is writing, the Torah is already redacted, and it's
Oh yeah. He knows about lo titchaten bam, right? But in his time, people weren't marrying the 7 nations. There were no more 7 nations.
Right,
They didn't exist
right.
anymore. So they were marrying other nations who were living there and saying, come on, Ezra, it doesn't say anywhere that I can't. But Ezra looks at the circumstances that he finds himself in, and he's saying, okay, I understand there's no 7 nations anymore, but you're all abandoning the covenant when you take these foreign wives. They're leading you astray, just like the 7 nations were leading the people astray hundreds of years ago. So we're gonna enter into a covenant and also stop taking foreign wives ourselves for that reason.
So,
Thanks.
vote.
But the Talmud doesn't mention Ezra as much as it mentions the Hasmonean court.
Can I comment?
Right? Yes, Stephen, go ahead.
Okay, times are different today. We don't have control over our society. We're not living in shtetls where we're very insular. So the situation is that we have little control in the world today, and this 15 million or 16 million ceiling that we seem to never get above is very important. So it's not from just what's without, it's from what's within. And one group addresses that. One group. We do in conservative Judaism, yes, but there's one group, and you know who it is. It's Chabad. They address this situation right on.
Agreed.
So I have to ask one question, and
Okay.
maybe someone has the answer. One has to look at today, even though it's in hindsight, because honestly, anti-Semitism was there since the time of Pharaoh, and we keep being annihilated. Having said that, if you do a Pew report, a Pew study, and you do how many people from intermarriage, the next generation marries out of the faith, and how many people from conversions, the next generation marries out of the faith, those are the questions that we need to answer.
But you're getting into demographics, and we said we weren't going to talk about demographics. But I do agree with you, Rose. Everyone knows the data, right? And intermarriage is a reality today, and I think there are, you will hear from both sides, right? It's almost like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said yes. Oh no, Rabbi Shimon said absolutely not. You'll hear today that both arguments on how to preserve Judaism, right? The way to preserve Judaism is to be welcoming, because if we're not welcoming, they'll intermarry and leave. Or the way to preserve Judaism is to build the boundaries higher, make the punishments worse for people who intermarry. So everyone, I think, has the same goal, but different methods
To achieve the goal
of getting there, right? Nobody wants Judaism to disappear. The question is how are the challenges we're facing different or similar to what our ancestors faced in the past? And do we have enough of a different circumstance now to want to revisit some of those rabbinic prohibitions and say, today we should take a different approach, except in the following circumstances. But don't worry, we're going to get there. We're just in the middle of the material. Today, I hope, was a good overview of how responding to reality is a core duty of rabbinic leaders in Judaism. You need to see the world around you. You can't be locked up in a yeshiva and just staring at books all day and expect to contribute something to Judaism. It's about looking at the people and understanding what is it that we need today in order to respond to their needs and to ensure that Judaism survives and thrives in whatever context we find ourselves. Sorry for the internet issues, but I'm happy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
with my
much. Great
backup.
class.
Have a great morning, everyone.